Counties have an extremely special place in my heart, and the reason is this. When I was 10 years old, I guess maybe when I was younger than that, my grandfather was elected as Justice of the Peace in Poinsett County. I don't know if we have any Poinsett County folks here, but it's where I grew up, and my granddad was a JP for 30 years. He was chairman of the Roads Committee, chairman of the 911 Committee, so when our road became Sadler Lane, no one was shocked as to how that happened. But when I was about 10, I started going with my granddad to court meetings. And it was kind of amusing because it was me, it was the quorum court, it was the county judge, it were all the county elected officials, and nobody else. And so, maybe the reporter from the Jonesboro Sun and maybe the Modern News in Harrisburg was there, but generally I was the only person there just to go. And I always thought that was fascinating even as a kid. But I think it shows also the struggles that you guys have in connecting with the public and connecting with media about what you do and the importance of what county officials do. So I hope today, as I talk to you about working with the media, we can also talk about what it means to get your story out there and how you can do so effectively. Again, my name is Aaron Sadler. I've been a reporter for a long time. I started reporting when I was 12 years old, so if up in the right-hand corner, that's my biggest get in my life. Right before Bill Clinton ran for president, when he was governor, I went and interviewed him for the Truman, I think it was the Chronicle at that time. There were two competing papers in my small hometown in Poinsett County. And I worked for the Chronicle, and then, as I like to say, the Democrat, which was the long-standing, important paper in town. When I was 14, they were like, "We got to have you," and I was like, "Okay, I'll move up." So we did that for a while. I worked in Jonesboro while I went to ASU. I worked at the Jonesboro Sun. Then I bounced to Fort Smith for a while, and I covered Sebastian County and Crawford County pretty extensively. And then I got into state and national politics, and so I worked for Stevens Media here in Little Rock, and then in Washington, D.C., where I had the fortunate opportunity to cover my Huckabee on the campaign trail in 2008. I came back to Arkansas and worked for ADEQ, the Department of Environmental Quality, who, if any of you, I'm sure, deal with solid waste, you have to deal with ADEQ from time to time. So I was their public information officer before getting on with Dustin McDaniel. I worked as Dustin's press secretary and later his chief administrative officer until he was term limited. Bounced to Pennsylvania to work as communications director for the attorney general there. The day I got there is the day I learned that she was about to be indicted, so I didn't stay there very long. And I'm sure we'll get into that too, especially if you have any questions about what it's like to work for someone who's about to go to jail. It's very, very fun, and to do her media and to try to stay on message. Then I returned to the South, and I worked in Louisiana and in Mississippi in the same role as communications director for AGs. And then earlier this year, I decided I wanted to get back close to home for a variety of reasons. But one of the biggest was that I'm an Arkansan. I love Arkansas. I love our people. My family and friends were here. And so now I'm working in private public relations, where I essentially do everything that I did when I was working in state government, except I do it for private individuals and private companies. So retail, healthcare, restaurants. The world's largest rubber band company is one of my clients. I was just there this morning, so it's a diverse skill set that I have to utilize. But at its root is being in contact with and working with the media. I feel like that's my specialty, and I want to share with you a little bit about that today. The title of my presentation is Think Like a Reporter. And the reason why I say think like a reporter is because that's how you can communicate well with reporters if you think like them. If you notice the slide down below, my name is Aaron Sadler, although TV stations like to call me Adam Sandler. That is not me. But anybody that wants to call me Adam, I'll answer to it because I'm accustomed to that anyway. So what does it mean to think like a reporter? Well, the first thing we need to remember is reporters already have sort of there's a jaundiced view in the world about what a reporter is, adjectives used to describe them, and kind of in the same vein are politicians, elected officials, lawyers. I mean, there's this doctor, police officer, firefighter mentality out there in the world, and then there's the sleazy journalist, the attorney, the politician. So when we think about what a reporter is, and I challenge you to think about reporters before we start thinking like a reporter, there are some adjectives that immediately come up. You know, people say reporters are nosy. Well, they kind of have to be. It's their job. They're dishonest. I don't think so. Rude, sometimes. Difficult, lazy. Yeah, I used to have an editor who would say, reporters are inherently lazy. So let's remember that when we start talking about how to think like a reporter. Knowing that reporters are inherently lazy, which I tend to agree with, will help you in your media relations techniques. Mean, stupid, arrogant, all those are things that I'm sure at one time or another when you've been dealing with a reporter, whether it's somebody in your county that has been a reporter for 50 years, or whether it's somebody from Fayetteville or from Little Rock who is just parachuting into your county because there's an issue, you've thought about these things and used these words. People have hated reporters for lifetimes. I mean, Lyndon Johnson is famous for saying that if he were to wake up one morning, walk on the water across the Potomac, the headline in the paper would say, "President can't swim." Bobby Knight says he learned how to write by second grade, but then he moved on to something else. And then even back to Civil War times, this is my favorite quote about reporters, is from William Sherman, who said, "If I had my choice, I would kill every reporter in the world, but I'm sure we would be getting reports from hell before breakfast." So there's always been a serious distaste for reporters and what reporters do. But I'm here to tell you today that reporters are necessary. They need you, you need them. And so the best thing we can do is learn how to work in tandem with them to get our communications out there. Reporters themselves think these things. They think they're overworked, overwhelmed, underpaid, underemployed, exhausted, and stressed. Everybody thinks that, right? That's not really different than anybody else who has a job. But reporters, because they're in the limelight, just like you guys, there really aren't that many dissimilarities between what we do and what reporters do. But reporters especially, in the last 10 years, for instance, as there's attrition, there is the move from from newsprint to internet, from TV to internet, advertising sales aren't anything what they were even a decade ago. Reporters are more overworked, they're more overwhelmed, they're underpaid, underemployed, exhausted, and stressed. That's a theme you'll hear over and over. If you took the time to talk to the beat reporters that come to your county courthouses, you'll find that out. In 2013, journalist was listed as CareerCast.com's worst job in America. That was 4 years before fake news. I mean, where are we now? In 2013, those were the halcyon times, right? Everybody loved reporters in 2013. Now we have fake news and everybody hates us. Reporters say their jobs are worse because of many things. Low pay, high stress, long hours among them. Uncertainty is a huge one. The reason why I came back from Washington is because they shut down my bureau. Stevens Media just decided arbitrarily one day, in the height of the 2008 campaign, that they could no longer afford to sustain a bureau in Washington. There were 5 of us in the bureau. We come in one morning, that afternoon, we're leaving. That uncertainty continues and is even worse now. This is something that as a county official, I would urge you to understand and realize when you have a young reporter or even a reporter that's been around for dozens of years come into your office on a day and stressed, or maybe even when you have to deal with somebody and they ask you for more than you think you should be willing to give. It's probably because 10 years ago they had 20 colleagues and this year they only have 7 or 8. So one of the things when you think about a reporter, you need to think about, even just down the road at the Democrat Gazette, just last week, or I guess the week before last, 27 employees of the Democrat Gazette lost their jobs. And this wasn't the first layoff that they've had. And it's not getting better. The trends continue to say that newspaper and TV consumption are going down. If you noticed last night, NFL ratings are down significantly, but that is a trend. It's not just NFL, it's everything. Not a lot of people watch NFL anymore on TV. They watch it online on their mobile devices, or they have other things to do. It's the same way with newspaper consumption. It's the same way with radio listening. People listen to Spotify or Pandora, so they're not tuning in to the news that we're traditionally familiar with. And that causes a lot of stress in reporters, and that should cause you, when you think about a reporter, to remember where they're coming from. So a typical day for a newspaper reporter, and I was a former newspaper reporter. I do a lot of interaction with broadcast reporters now, but newspaper was my heart and soul, and that's really where I know the history of. And so I just thought I'd give you an idea about what a reporter does every day. They typically come in, they have a meeting with their editors, they're told what story they have to write. I mean, let's say, for instance, the carnival's in town that day, so they go to the carnival at 9:30 and talk to some carnival workers, and then at 11, they're going to Rotary because you're giving a speech about next year's budget, or Parks and Recreation, or something like that. So not only do they have a crammed schedule, but they have a schedule that is full of things that are dissimilar to each other. I mean, then they have to come back and they have to put it all together. They have to remember, what did the carnival barker say? What did the county assessor say? How can I make these stories sing? And how can I engage my readers? It's another reason why we need to be good at how we communicate with reporters, because they are not masters of our trade. And so, we'll get to that in a minute. But when we think about reporters, I've told you all this gloom and doom, and there is some bad news. The bad news is that as demands increase, so does the difficulty of communicating effectively with the media. You're not going to have somebody at your office every day anymore. When I covered county courthouses, I was at the county courthouse every day. I dove into a county clerk's office. I'd then go see the treasurer. I'd probably spend 30 minutes talking in the treasurer's office in Sebastian County about the love life of a 25-year-old newcomer to Fort Smith. And somehow I get like one piece of information that I turn into an enterprise story the next day. I wouldn't have time to spend 30 minutes anywhere anymore because of my daily grind. So it's incumbent upon us to make sure the reporters are receiving our messages. And I also think as public servants, we have obligation to them. I know that's probably not a word any of you like. When I worked in state government and I handled statewide press for Dustin and for 3 other attorneys general, I wasn't a big fan when reporters called me, but I also felt like if I was getting tax money, it was important to me and it was important to the public to fulfill my obligation to convey to them accurate, timely, important information. And I think we have an obligation to help every reporter that knocks on our door because they are the gatekeepers to the public. And I think we need to keep that in mind. There's also some good news. The good news is the media and the public need concise and effective messages from thought leaders. And you all as elected officials are thought leaders. They are going to come to you for your thoughts because they don't have time anymore to get them from anybody else. No longer can we talk to 20 or 30 different people for a story. They're coming to the source, and you are the source. And because of that, you control what is said. That means you can get your message out now more effectively than you have been able to any other time because you are the guy or you are the lady that they're talking to. And that's what's important. Here's some more good news. You can give your unfiltered messages to everybody, whether it be through social media, whether it be through traditional media methods like radio, TV, or broadcast, if you just think like a reporter. And hopefully I can share with you some tactics today that will help you do that. So thinking like a reporter, we'll talk about just a couple of reporter truths. The first one is the job is the life. I'm sure all of you are the same way. When you go to dinner, when you go to church, when you're celebrating Thanksgiving with your folks, if there's something that is happening in your county, you're still the official that you are. When I was a reporter, that is probably the thing that bothered me the most, is I could never shed that reporter's skin. I remember I was in D.C. in Arkansas State University, which I love, Wolves Up, everybody. Came to D.C., and so the president, Les White, if anybody knows him or remembers him at the time, he came to do some lobbying, and they had an alumni reception. And I was invited as an alumnus, and I was very excited to do this. And the minute I got into the room, Les sees me, and he says, "All right, everybody, there's the reporter, let's be quiet." And I was really offended because I was like, I don't have my notepad. I'm not here to cover this event. I'm here because I graduated from your college and you invited me here. That is a stigma that is attached to reporters. It's both good and bad. In that instance, it was bad, but it's good in that they live their jobs. The job is life, and I think it's life for you guys too. They always want to get it right. We never intentionally, when I was a reporter, we never intentionally screwed up. Every screw up I ever made was one that I didn't want to happen. I never lied. If there was something that was a falsehood, it was because I made an error or a message was given to me that was incorrect. And the third one, the third truth is that they need your help. Reporters can't do their jobs without you. That gives you some awesome power and responsibility, and also puts you in a good position to get your message across. But reporters need your help. Here's some fake news about reporters. They're out to get you. They're not out to get you. I mean, I had people that I liked. I had people that I didn't like. But I never had any malice, and I never tried to, run anybody off or get anybody to lose their election or anything like that. I didn't have time to do that because I had other things going on. Likewise, they're not just trying to sell papers or drive ratings. Now, there might be somebody up in the ivory tower that's making 10 or 12 times what I was making for my piddly, $12 an hour. That is trying to sell papers or drive ratings. But I won several awards, and I had a lot of stories that propelled me in my career. Never one time did anybody come back to me and say, yes, Aaron, we had a goal of selling 30,000 papers today, and we sold 32,000. That never happened. Nobody pays attention to any of that. Usually it's, what have you done for me lately? And then their worldview is not your worldview. We'll talk more about this, because I think there's a misconception, and when I moved from being a journalist to being on the side of dealing with journalists, I had part of this too. And it was that when I'm sharing with you information, you're going to take the information I want you to take and use it in the way I want you to use it. We could argue what color the sky is right now and see the same sky and still have different opinions about it. And that's really, I think, that's the rub when we talk about all those adjectives, remember, that we talked about earlier about why we hate reporters? I think that's probably the rub. It's that, not necessarily they're doing a bad job, it's that they're not doing the job that we want them to do. And so I want to give you some strategies today to help make that equation not fake news, but truth. I think when we get through today, if you don't have strategies to make your worldview their worldview, then I haven't done my job. That's the biggest thing. I mean, it's they took me out of context. How many people have said that before? How many times, I want to see your hands. How many times have you seen a story or something in the newspaper or on TV and say, they took me out of context? Yeah, almost everybody, because that happens. And I don't think it's necessarily, and it could be, I mean, I don't know your specific stories, but I don't think it's necessarily that they took you out of context. They just didn't see what you saw. And so there are some ways you can mitigate that, and we'll talk about those. So to think like a reporter and mitigate that, I say that you need to do three things. You need to anticipate, you need to evaluate, and then you execute. So by anticipating, what you need to do is take nothing for granted. For instance, because there are fewer reporters and they're making less money and things are constantly changing and more people who are journalists are going into PR or going into other communications fields, you're dealing with new reporters all the time. Perhaps, again, your county has somebody that's been there forever. They won't be there forever. When you get somebody new, it's probably going to be somebody that would rather cover sports than the county. Or it might be somebody that came here from Michigan or Wisconsin or California. And I promise you that the reporter who came here from Michigan, the first thing that he or she is going to ask when he or she rolls into the county courthouse is, the county judge, who did they sentence today? What were their convictions like today? Aren't they lawyers? And it's up to us to say, oh, wait a minute. Arkansas has this really unique situation in which a county judge is an executive. And let us explain to you what that means. Or, for instance, a quorum court. If I hadn't been going to quorum court meetings with my grandpa when I was 10 years old, I wouldn't know what a quorum court was. If you told me it was a legislative body that determines budgets, I would laugh. because I'm like, why in the world would you call it a quorum court? A court sounds like a judicial function. Likewise, equalization board. I remember the first time I walked into an equalization board meeting, they had never seen a reporter. They were scared to death, and they violated FOIA over and over again. But here's the thing. When they found out that there was a reporter there, and there were these property owners that were coming in for their hearings, and the property owners hated the reporter there as much or more than the equalization board hated the reporter there, suddenly their tune changed. It's just there had never been any light on them, and nobody had ever stopped to say, hey, Jonesboro Sun reporter, let me tell you about this weird thing that Arkansas has in its law that actually is kind of cool and very newsworthy, called an equalization board. Likewise, ad valorem, it's not a Dan Brown novel. Reporters don't know that. You have to tell them that. You have to tell them that records aren't just things you put on a record player. And you have to tell them, the county clerk has these kind of records. She or he has deeds and property records and this and that. The circuit clerk has all the court records. People don't automatically know that unless you tell them. And especially as reporters are newer, as they're coming from different places and they're making less money, it's your obligation to tell them those things. So take nothing for granted. Also, prepare for anything. As an elected official, I don't know what you feel or how you feel about your employees or courthouse employees in general talking to the media. But I will tell you this, when I was a reporter and the statute of limitations has expired on whatever could have happened to those people, don't go home and fire them or anything like that. But when I was a reporter, the most news I got was not from talking to the elected official. I enjoyed talking to the officials. That was fine. I was good with that. But I remember in Sebastian County, I'd spend 45 minutes to the hour in the IT department. IT department was where my resources were. And so in fact, Sharon Brooks, I think she's still the circuit or the county clerk in Sebastian County, worked in the IT department. And I remember talking to Sharon about okay, what's Hudson doing today? What's going on? And that was a courthouse that might not be unlike any of yours where, there were different officials who had different political parties. So there was all this undercurrent of mystique and undercurrent of suspicion because the treasurer was suspicious of the judge and the judge was suspicious of the clerk because he thought that they would run against them, and all this was going on. And I wasn't talking to the clerk and the judge to get all this. I was going to IT, I was going to HR, I was going to the people who lived it every day, the executive assistants to the sheriff, and that's where I was finding this information. So never believe that the only way people are getting information is from you. They're getting them from other people. A good reporter will do that. So please anticipate that. Also anticipate having a communications plan. And I know you guys have plans for disasters. I know you have plans for what happens when you don't have budget money. I know you have all these written plans. You need a communications plan. You need to have a plan that says what happens when there is a catastrophe or a crisis. What happens if one of my my deputy assessors is arrested for child pornography? What do I do? How do I convey this message? You need to have a plan. It's one of the things that I think Christy and her folks might be able to help you with. Ghidotti Communications, we do strategic crisis and communications plans all the time. These things would have your talking points that you need to say in the event of a crisis, or what the types of people who need to be your spokesman. Who's going to talk? Who's going to say what? How you're going to roll out your messages? What it means on social media? How you're going to make sure that you mitigate whatever crisis there is? You need to have a plan in place before you have a crisis. As somebody who worked for attorneys general who were in crisis all the time. I mean, there were several crises I had to deal with here. I told you about Pennsylvania. They happen all the time. So if you don't have a plan in place, you're missing the boat because it's going to take you a long time to figure out what you're going to do when a crisis actually happens. So again, like I said, there are plenty of people that can help you with that. We can help you with that. I think the association has the resources that you would need. Also, in part of anticipation is remember your elevator pitch. And I'm not talking about selling anything. I'm talking about what would you say if a reporter came up to you today and said, what do you do? The reason why I say that is because if you remember Teddy Kennedy in 1979 was interviewed by 60 Minutes, and he was about to unseat Jimmy Carter as the Democratic nominee and may or may not have won the presidency. but he was probably going to win the nomination from a sitting U.S. president in 1980. And he was interviewed on 60 Minutes, and the question was, why do you want to be president? And 3 minutes and a rambling, incoherent mess of words later, he was no longer the front runner for the Democratic nomination. And it's because he didn't know the answer to the simplest question, which is, why do you want to be president? Likewise, you guys always need to be ready for someone asking you, why's the budget going to be cut next year? Why do you want to run for another term as whatever your position is? What is it about so-and-so that makes you not like him or her? Have that elevator pitch at the ready, because you never know when you're going to get asked that question. And it might not just be from a reporter, it may be from anybody. Reporters, contrary to popular belief, they rarely stake out and throw a camera in your face and attack you as you're walking out the door. If they do, you probably should have had a communications plan. But in the event that they do that, you do need to know what you're going to say. And that's what I mean by elevator pitch. Then you evaluate. After you've got all your anticipation of what in the world could possibly you have to talk about to a reporter, then it comes time you're actually going to talk to a reporter. You need to evaluate what that circumstance is. So the first thing you need to do, if Jill Smith calls you and says, I'm with 4029 News in Rogers, and I want to talk to you about equalization boards. I've brought that up already. I would immediately go to the 4029 News website and look for stories that Jill Smith has done before. And what I would do is I'd find out what kind of, has she done any kind of political coverage before? If not, what kind of coverage does she do? Why do you think that they're assigning her this story? Is it because she has an interest in county government, or is it because they just need somebody to do a story? Because that's going to help how you first meet your obligation to make sure you take nothing for granted, and also prepare for the story. I mean, TV reporters by nature aren't going to be as in-depth as newspaper reporters, but if a TV reporter has a background in covering your county, or perhaps she's covered property issues in cities, you want to be a little more prepared. You can do that by looking at their old stuff. Follow them on social media. Everybody's got social media accounts. You can find out anything you want to know generally on social media. If you look at my social media right now, you'd see it's all about Arkansas State University football and corny jokes. So if I were to interview you, I think the greatest strategy you could do to set me at ease and make me probably not ask as tough questions as what I would is say something like, oh, I see the Red Bulls play South Alabama this weekend. I hope they do well. Wolves up. And I'd be like, oh yeah, you're right. We spent 15 minutes talking about ASU football. And then I'd forget what I was talking to you about because you were my friend already. Likewise, find common connections. We're in Arkansas. I mean, everybody knows everybody, and if you don't know that person you're talking to, you're going to know somebody they do know. So pry for that connection. I mean, when you meet a reporter for the first time, say, where do you go to church? Do you go to church? Where did you go to school? Where do you live in our community? Anything, and if they live, likely they're going to live in an apartment complex because they're poor and they're young. And you'll say, oh, I know 17 other people that live in that apartment complex. And in fact, my deputy HR director, he just moved out of there. Immediate connection, sets them at ease, puts you in a better position to answer their questions. Also, research your topic. If you know what they're calling about, then you need to find supporting documents. So if they're calling about, we'll use the EQ board as an example. If they're calling about the EQ board, and there are some documents that will help you in your case, whatever that might be, have them ready. There's nothing wrong with providing those documents. If the chairman of the EQ board is also going to be an ally in this, recommend that they talk to him or her as well. So for supporting sources, you might want to have sources in the room. If you're a county judge and you're talking about parks or roads there's a bridge that's out. There's nothing that says that when you're setting up an interview with a reporter, whether it be newspaper, print, or radio, or broadcast, that you can't say, hey, I'll bring my road superintendent. He can sit in, and he or she can help answer that question for us. And then maybe something that's controversial, the Freedom of Information Act is your friend. It is your friend. I promise you it is. Now, in some cases, you want to use it as a shield and not a sword, and I get that. Working in government for as long as I did, I think Colin can say as well, the best thing that ever happened to me as a communications director for an attorney general is the working papers exemption that attorneys general have here in Arkansas, in which everything is shielded from disclosure. That was great, but it's not for you guys. So you got to accept that, and you got to use it as a sword. And what do I mean by that? I mean every email, every memo, every public record that you create, if you look at it from the prism of everybody in the world is going to see this, shape it accordingly. So when you write an email and you're talking about a budget issue and you're sending it to somebody, then you might want to throw a little paragraph in there that's unnecessary but gives it context. Say, we're fighting this budget battle because of a downturn in property value and a general economic malaise. I mean, whatever you want to say that may eventually get back into the public sphere. Because then at the point when you have a reporter call you and ask you about a budget issue, you don't have to repeat that. You can say, you know what? I knew this was coming. And 6 months ago, I sent this email to all my department heads. And it's FOIAble, so if you want to ask for it, I'll give it to you. And right there, you use FOIA as a sword, not a shield. Likewise, there might be something that's sensitive, that probably you're not the person that needs to release the information, for whatever reason. It may be sensitive about, not necessarily a personnel matter, but something that might be politically sensitive, or something that you just don't want to be out front talking about, but you want it made known. Use FOIA. Find ways to use the documents that you already have to make sure the press and the public are aware of what's going on. I think FOIA as a sword can be used effectively, and I think people are too scared of the word FOIA to use it enough. Once you evaluate, you're also going to evaluate your research, and research your format and your setting. So you gotta decide, where are you most comfortable? If a reporter calls you and says, I want to interview you, there's nothing that says that you have to go do the interview where they want to do it. You can do it at the TV studio if you're comfortable. You can say, come to my office, come to my house. Let's go to the bridge that's collapsed and let's shoot it there. Anywhere you're comfortable. Decide whether you want to do the interview by phone or in person. Newspaper and radio reporters are generally a lot more open to a phone conversation than TV. TV would be open to phone if you just don't have the time, or you don't want to see your face on TV like me. I have a face for radio. I try to avoid TV at all costs. And then you got to decide too, how important is this issue? If you have multiple, this is really key for if you have multiple outlets in your county. If you have one newspaper and that's it, then you probably always want to sit down and do an interview with whoever it is you're covering. If you have multiple newspapers, radio stations, TV stations, this is big news, you might want to hold a news conference. Get it all out there. Just come in, have everybody come at the same time. It's more convenient for you, it's less stressful for you and your staff to get it done. If it's something that's really sensitive or coming up really quickly, I mentioned the hypothetical of a deputy assessor being arrested for something awful. You might just want to issue a statement. It's a personnel matter, and I trust that the law enforcement are handling this appropriately. Any of those things, and not even do anything like that. The big takeaway here, though, is it's your choice. The reporters want information from you, so they will be willing to take it in whatever way you want to give it to them. Give it to them in the way that is most comfortable to you, because you can control the interview, you control the message, and you make your worldview their worldview. So after all that, you execute the message. And how do you do that? Well, there are some general strategies that I would say for you executing the message and getting to the point. The first one, we've touched on this a little bit, avoid jargon. Silence is sometimes golden. What I mean by that? I didn't take a tape recorder to enter any of my interviews. The reason was this. So I take my notepad, I'd ask a question, and the county official would be talking, and they'd answer the question, and I'd be writing down everything that they said, and there would be this 20 or 30 second gap in which nobody was saying anything. And finally, as I was just catching up on what they had said before, they were so uncomfortable from the silence that they would continue talking and give me more information than I really wanted. And usually I got better information after the silence than I did from the initial question. That's a tactic. Law enforcement uses it, attorneys use it, reporters use it. Don't be, or rather, allow the silence. Don't say anything more than what you're going to say. Don't feel uncomfortable. Wait it out. If you have to stare at them for a little while and say, what's your next question? So be it. Don't allow the silence to get you into a trap in which your worldview is not their worldview. Speak to your audience. Remember who you're talking to. You're not just talking to a reporter. You're talking to the 20,000 people that read whatever paper, or the 50,000 people that watch whatever news station. Always speak to your audience. Don't speak directly to that individual. Repeat, repeat, repeat. I've said things over and over again today because it's important. That's why we had 3-point enumerations in high school. That's why you hear preachers talk about saying the same thing 3 different ways. I'm about to show you a statement that I wrote that kind of has the same thing 3 different ways. It's always important to repeat so they capture it and they get your context. They get your worldview. Speaking sound bites, again, that goes back to the fact that there's less TV space, less TV time, and less newspaper space. So you need to convey what you know they're going to use, and don't go into a long, 30-second scenario when really a 5-second answer suffices. And then say your first things first and your best things last. Sometimes your first things and your best things are the same thing, so that goes back to repeat. But you want to get in there and you don't bury the lead. So you say whatever it is you want to talk about first. And if that is the best thing you're going to say during that interview, you say it again at last. Because you want them to go away realizing what it was that was important to you. Again, because they're so stressed and they have so much to do, you're controlling the message, you're giving them mental reminders over and over again. This is what the important part of the story is. Don't let them decide what's important. You tell them what's important. This is a statement I wrote when I was in Louisiana. I hope it doesn't put you to sleep, but it encapsulates all these tips. And it's a statement that was written after the Supreme Court decision at Obergefell. And Louisiana at the time, and like Arkansas and other states in the South, had passed a constitutional amendment that said marriage was between one man and one woman. I worked for a Republican Attorney General, and so he was very staunchly anti-Obama and staunchly in the camp of marriage being between one man and one woman. And so this was a message that was conveyed to his constituents and to the people of Louisiana. And this was a statement we sent out. The reason why we sent out a statement is because it happened on a Monday morning, I think, or I think that was a Thursday. And by, the decision came down at 9:30, and by 10 o'clock we had every news outlet in Louisiana calling and asking for something. So a statement was our best form. And this is what we said. The Supreme Court decision overturns the will of the people of Louisiana, and it takes away a right that should have been left to the states. Louisiana voters decided overwhelmingly to place in our Constitution an amendment that defines marriages between one man and one woman. I fought to uphold Louisiana's definition of traditional marriage, and I was the first Attorney General in the nation to be successful at the federal court level. I'm extremely disappointed by this decision. It fails to respect traditional marriage as defined by Louisiana voters, and is yet another example of the federal government intrusion into what should be a state issue. So what did I do? I put my first thing first and my best thing last. It's the same thing. The first sentence and the last sentence are exactly the same. They're just said differently. Likewise, I say several times, this was what voters wanted. We were just doing what voters wanted. That way, when a TV station or a newspaper gets this, they're going to look at that and their eyes are going to gloss over it and they're going to say, there's no way I'm going to be able to put a 100-word statement from Buddy Caldwell in a story about a landmark Supreme Court decision. Let me pull out 5 or 6 words. When you write like this, when you think like this, when you're interviewing, the 5 or 6 words they pull out, no matter what they are going to be words that you want them to pull out. They can take anything out of that because it all sounds the same and says the same thing. By doing something like that, you have effectively made your worldview their worldview. So this was kind of what I thought was sort of the template statement that I've written all my life when it comes to media relations, because it says the same thing 3 different ways, it gets my points across, and no matter what sentence they pull, my boss is going to be happy with that because it's what they want them to use. Another way you execute is in your messaging, likewise in the statement. We stuck to just a few key messages. You don't need to get out there. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. Start talking about things that are just tangential to the message. You enhance the messages with supporting information and anecdotes. So, yeah, you have this key message that this is a states' rights issue, it's not a federal issue. That's your key message, and then you can always put in supporting messages. Like, one of the supporting messages we use is, oh yeah, by the way, and we won on this in the federal court level. They're always always stair steps in your talking points when you're developing them if you need to do that, but they always go back to the key message. And then also you use your colleagues and staff as a sounding board when you're writing your talking points, or if you have somebody writing them for you. Then feel free to bring your friends, your staff, counterparts in other counties and say, hey, does this sound right? Hey, do you think this works? Do you think the public would be interested in hearing me say this? That's always helpful, and there's nothing to say that you can't do that. One of the biggest things you do is you bridge. And bridging and transitions I'll talk a little bit about, because I think it's one of the most important things you can do to keep those key messages and keep your context the same. Unfortunately, I couldn't bring a video because this was 2010, and I wasn't able to. I called the ATN. I did everything I could to find this video, but unfortunately, I'm just going to have to explain it to you. But I think it's relevant as one of the best ways to bridge. And I remember in 2010, I was watching the debates on ATN between Shane Broadway, who was an ASU guy who I love, and if Shane's watching this, I love you, Shane, but I got to tell this story. And Mark Darr, who was a pizza man, I think that's what he did, I'm not sure, who came from nowhere to run for lieutenant governor as a Republican. And they're standing there at the debate, and one of the questions comes from Doug Thompson, who was in Northwest Arkansas, and his question is this: Senator Broadway, the lieutenant governor has really only a couple roles. One of them is to be in waiting in the event of the death or the resignation of the governor, and the other is to run the Senate, to be president of the Senate. Because the lieutenant governor's role is so limited, can you tell us about procedural issues in the Senate like sounding the ballot? Well, I've never heard of sounding the ballot, just like many people have never heard of an EQ board or an ad valorem tax or all those things. And so I'm like, well, this is interesting. I wonder what he's going to say. And Broadway says, well, of course, Doug, I've been in the Senate for 8 years, and I've sat in the president's chair as president pro tem on occasion, and so sounding the ballot is this and this and this and this and this. He answered the question. It was exactly what Doug had asked. But then it came time for Darr for rebuttal. And I didn't know this guy Darr. Nobody did, really. And I didn't have any idea about his political heft or what his plans were or anything. But he says, and this is something I will never forget, it had such an impact on me, was, well, I appreciate Senator Broadway and his long-time public service. He's been working and collecting a check from taxpayers since he was, 22 years old. Point one made, right? This guy's a long-time public servant, which means he's getting a check and he's gone out in the real world. And then he says, and I don't necessarily know what sounding the ballot is, but I'm sure there'll be plenty of time for me to learn that. But while Senator Broadway has been learning about things that nobody else cares about, like sounding the ballot, I've been learning about what it's like to start a small business, to have to deal with the burdens of health insurance premiums, to have to do this and have to do this and have to do this as a small businessman who's not being funded by the government, essentially. And after that, it totally changed my view of Darr. I didn't think Darr was a player at the time. After that one answer, where he bridged from something he was uncomfortable with to something that he could hit out of the park, I had a little bit more respect for him. So bridging is an effective technique. And you're asking, well, what is bridging? It's pretty simple. So just what Mark Darr did. He took a question that he didn't like, and he turned it back to his key message. Well, how do you do that? Well, let's talk about today. Let's talk about, you go back to your counties, and somebody says, well, what did you do on Thursday, November 9th? I was told that you went to Little Rock, and you spent all day in Little Rock, and you weren't here managing the county or managing your office. Tell me about that. How much money was spent? And you can say, well, that's true, Mr. or Miss Reporter. I did go down there, but the important issue is what I learned, I can come back and use in the community. Yes, I did get a free lunch, but I think it would be more accurate to say I learned for free from the Association of Counties about great things that I can impart on our colleagues and how I can better communicate with you. Well, it might be a problem that I'm having to be paid mileage for my trip to Little Rock, but the real problem is that I can't really get out the message about the great things we're doing in the county without your help and without some knowledge about how to do that. Of course I spent time away in the county, but what all I've said comes down to the fact that spending time outside the county sometimes benefits in county because I can learn things that I couldn't readily learn here. And so on and on it goes. Always pivot back to your key messages, your important points. There are many other ways to bridge and transition. If you ever need any advice on that, I'm free to give it to you, and Christy will be too. As you execute too, you need to remember different things, like it's different to talk to a TV reporter than a newspaper reporter. Now, I have a newspaper background, that was my life, but I've facilitated many broadcast interviews, and so there are things I've learned in broadcast that I can convey to you too, which is just like use memorable words. It goes back to those sound bites. You got to remember that they're going to go back into an editing bay, and they're not going to have a lot of time to piece together the interview. So when you use memorable words, colorful sayings that you want them to use, those are what they're going to use because they're going to remember them. Your body language also speaks volumes on camera. If you remember Talladega Nights and Ricky Bobby, and he didn't know what to do with his hands, and it was really weird, and nobody knew what was going on. Don't do that. Act comfortable even if it's not comfortable. Never let them see you sweat. Always know that people are watching you, and so you need to convey an authoritarian and confident manner in your body language when you're talking on TV. Always look at the interviewer, not the camera. That's a TV thing that I don't really understand, but I mean, they like it and they tell you to do that, so don't get caught like sneaking into the camera. Always stay focused on your interviewer because that makes for a better segment. Wear neutral colors. You don't want people to say, oh my goodness, I can't pay attention to what they're saying because he's wearing some sort of purple, pink, mashup kind of crazy suit. Wear neutral. Don't let what you're wearing take away from what you're saying. And also, probably the most important thing for TV is take advantage of the setup time. When I was a reporter, I'd just walk in, sit down, start asking questions. TV reporters are going to come in. They'll usually have a camera person with them. They'll need to set up a tripod. They'll need to mic you. They'll need to get what's called a white balance. They'll set up a light maybe. They'll figure out where to sit you. So in that time, which takes about 5 or 10 minutes, use that effectively by talking to the reporter. What are you going to ask me? What is it we can talk about? How can I, what are some things that you need to know? And sort of have a pre-interview before the tape ever starts rolling. That helps them, and it also helps you to convey your message. And also, don't forget about radio. If you're calling in a radio show, stay on a landline. I know we don't have a lot of them anymore, but they provide a whole lot better feed. Radio people love you for it because they don't want any chance of the call dropping. They don't want any static. Avoid distractions, so go somewhere quiet. Don't have your colleagues or your employees coming in and giving you things. One thing to note with radio that you can't do for newspapers or with TV, so you can keep your talking points with you. You can have notes and use them. So anytime I advise somebody who's doing a radio interview, I always say, just take your notes with you. Nobody's going to know that you're looking at them. They don't see you. So you can always have them as a crutch if you need them. And just some miscellaneous tips that I have, and then we'll wrap up because I know I'm probably over my time. But you just need to practice. Always practice your stuff. I mean, with Dustin, we would have mock Q&As all the time. If he had a big interview, I'd sit down with him and I'd act like a reporter. And I'd say every possible awful question I could ask. And that he never got those questions, but he was ready for those questions. And you have people, whether it be your employees, your colleagues, your counterparts in other counties, your family, that can say, hey, I've got a big interview with so-and-so tomorrow, I'm a little nervous about it, what do you think they're going to ask? And if they're good, if they like you, they're going to say horrible things. Let's say if it's about this, what I'd ask is somebody said, I need you to do a story about this county official who went to Little Rock for this, junket paid for by the Association of Arkansas Counties. And I'd say, tell me who paid for it. How much personal money did you spend? Oh, you didn't spend any personal money. Whose county money did you spend? Who provided the catering? Did the catering company give you a political contribution? I mean, anything you could possibly think of that no reporter in their right mind would probably ever be comfortable asking you. Your friends will ask you that because they want you to be prepared and they want you to hit it out of the ballpark. So always practice. We talked about print and broadcast reporters. We haven't talked about bloggers really, who are really all the same. I mean, now that media confluence and everybody does everything. You know, you're blogging if you're a print reporter, you're putting stuff on the web, video on the web if you're a print reporter. Likewise, if you're a broadcast reporter, you're writing for the web. But you know, if you have bloggers in your community who you don't really deal with a lot, you might want to invite them to the courthouse from time to time and say, you know, let me take you to lunch or bring you lunch and show you what we do, explain to you a little bit about what we do in an environment that is easy, that is kind, that is something where you can get to know them and find those connections. And then my favorite tip of all time that I always give people is that you need to be friendly with any journalist you come into contact with. It just makes sense. I mean, you don't want to be antagonistic to a journalist. Always be friendly, but don't be their friends. You're not their friend. If they say they're your friend, it's fake news. They're lying. You're not their friend. They are doing a job just like you're doing a job. Be friendly to them. You're not going to be their friends. And in conclusion, I just remind you again to anticipate, evaluate, and execute. When you execute a successful strategy, you're thinking like a reporter. So I'll take plenty of questions. I left my contact number up there for you, and my email address. That's my cell number. I also have some business cards. I don't have enough for everybody in the room, but you know, I'm available at any time if you want to call and talk through a prickly issue. Likewise, I think Christy would probably be too. If you don't have your own communications folks, I'm happy to talk through whatever you need to talk through and give you what kind of advice I can give. If there are any questions, I'll be glad to answer them as well.
How do you correct a report? I'll give you an example. We had a budget meeting a couple of weeks ago. Prosecuting attorney's asking for an additional staff person. Prosecuting attorney threw out some numbers and stuff, and the reporter got the salary completely wrong. And then we had another finance committee meeting Monday night, and that was on the agenda again. We discussed that again, and the reporter was there, and I asked him where he got the number for the salary, $22,000. The salary is $27,000, but the true cost is $39,000. And the next morning in the paper, it's the wrong salary again. And I was trying to point out that they're asking us to spend $39,000, but they're only going to bring in $18,000 in revenue. And that's not a good business decision.
Right.
So, I mean, how do you correct a reporter when they're wrong?
Well,
I'd like to write a letter to the editor and say, this is how it really is.
Right. Well, you know, I sort of take there's almost like a formula you have to go through. You know, if they call me Adam Sandler, which has happened a lot, I don't call, because what's the point? You know, if I remember one time I was writing a story about a millage increase, and I didn't own a home, and nobody did the things that I've asked you guys to do, which is like be patient and explain things. So I was doing the math, and I did the math. And so instead of saying that the millage increase would mean $70 additional a year, I said $700. And I didn't have any context to realize that a $700 a year property tax increase was pretty significant. Because I didn't know, because I didn't pay property taxes, right? And the superintendent of the school the very next day he was ready to fire me, and I'm like, yeah, I probably deserve it, you know? So that is one that you need to immediately call about. But like that one, I think I would ask you first, what's the good there? Like, are there people that, and it sounds to me like that there are, that you're trying to make a point that this is you're spending double what you're going to earn. So in that regard, because to be honest, not a lot of people are going to notice a correction. I mean, very few people read the story anyway. Even fewer are going to read the second page where it's really small print that says correction. But if it happened multiple times, I think it's a perfect opportunity then for you to call the reporter. And it sounds to me like you've talked to the reporter, and it hasn't changed. So at that point, I say call the reporter's editor. And if it's a small newspaper and the reporter is the editor, then I say call the publisher. And if the reporter is the publisher, then I think you write the letter to the editor. But if it's something that you feel necessary to get the information correct, those would be my steps. First, start with the reporter, tell them why it's important. I mean, as soon as that superintendent called me, I knew exactly why it was important. So not only did we write a correction the next day, we had like the do-it-yourself calculator, where you could plug in your own numbers and figure out exactly what your property increase would be. And I'm convinced to this day that if they had lost that millage race, I probably wouldn't be fired, because it was that egregious an error. And we took it seriously. But if it's somebody's name that's misspelled, or if it's some sort of inconsequential fact, at this point in my time as a media relations person, I don't even call, because I just think you lose some relationship with the media outlet when you call and you're complaining about something that really isn't that big of a deal. But it sounds to me like, in your instance, it's probably something you need to escalate to an editor. And if you don't get a response from that, then I think a letter to the editor would be appropriate. And if they don't run it, I think you ask why. And you probably ask why in a public setting. The next time you're talking about this number, I would advise you to say, if you don't get the results that you need, I would advise you to say, I was wondering, this was in the paper as this, but it's really this. And so I want to make sure everybody in the audience knows, even though the paper said this, it's really this. That's another way to make sure that it gets corrected. You really not have to do anything with the reporter. It's just you using your own message.
Unfortunately, the audience is a 10-year-old boy.
Okay.
You.
Yeah, I get it. But you have the court report there, and you have other elected officials, and so, the needle's moving a little bit. But, do you guys put your meetings on social media? Is there somebody there to videotape them?
I'm trying to incorporate that.
That's another way to go around the media and, use that, put that on if you have Facebook or Instagram, put it on your own,
Isn't that a dangerous position to take, though? If you're confronting, personally, I would be afraid to then, not afraid, but nervous about confronting a reporter to point out, you want to get the correct information out there, but you also don't want to put yourself in the position that then that reporter is going to be looking for every negative thing to present about you.
I really think that you were, I think that that's not the case. And I don't know every individual reporter, but when I was a reporter, I wanted to know if I was making an error. I used to, depending on whatever entity I was working for, I had an editor who, when I worked at the Sun, I think our circulation was 27,000, and he would say, every mistake you made, it's just not a mistake, it's made 27,000 times. And so if I made a mistake, I want to know. Sometimes they're blissfully unaware. In this case, it could be that they heard you, and it might not be malicious at all. It could be what we talked about, they don't have enough time, they go back to their office, they're trying to write within 30 minutes to get it in the paper, and they're using the last story and just cutting and pasting part of it, and don't even think or don't even read it. And then nobody else reads it. Funny story, when I was in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, the Harrisburg Patriot News had a policy of not having copy editors. So what happened is a reporter would put their story on the web without anybody looking at it ever. And the only way they would correct anything is if a reader had said in the comments, oh yeah, you spelled this wrong. They had no ability to copy edit before the fact because they didn't have people employed to do that. They relied on their readers to call them and say, oh, this was wrong, this was wrong, this was wrong. It makes for awful journalism, but to your point, it makes it necessary for you to call out a reporter.